Hi. Wow, that's great. Normally I have to wake the audience up. This was even better. Good afternoon. I'm standing between you and Mickey, so I'll make it quick. First of all, the slides for this I'm sure will be billions of places, but I know they'll be there, and hopefully a webcast of this as well, and audio. Also, pardon me? Hello?
Podcasting.
And podcasting. Also, you'll find lots of other specific examples of reference and things of that nature there. Social networking and reference is perhaps the least inspired title that I could think of coming up with. And so as I was there last night, fidgeting with the slides, I thought maybe we'd go with something like, but Mom, all the other kids have tag clouds. Part of the reason I'm here today is because I received an email from Donna Dinberg, or Din as we call it, and I love Din, and if Din tells me to be somewhere, I'm somewhere. So when she sent me the email, she said, Dave, we'd like you to talk about this, and here are the kinds of things we want you to talk about. IM, chat services, commercial versus homegrown, Go browsing, Meebo, plugin, social networking, MySpace, Facebook, Mashup, Flickr, YouTube, texting over reference. So I'll be here till next week. No, I'm going to do it. And I'm going to do it without actually showing you one screenshot. So it should be fun. But this list is really interesting because I think this list really does a good job of typifying where we are right now and reference it in libraries in general. Which is, I remember in the early days of virtual reference, as we come onto the virtual reference desk conference and such, and there was almost this like peer pressure going on for why aren't you doing virtual reference? Oh my God, I have to do virtual reference. And, all the cool kids were doing Dublin Core and these things. And, I think we had this sort of interesting pack mentality as librarians where we feel like someone else is clearly doing something more interesting and we've got to do it. And the net result is that you end up with all this sort of social networking and participatory this and that and that. And I love this picture because I think it represents it really well. This is the web trend map from 2007. And what someone did was take prominent sites like Flickr and Google and Gmail and all of the Facebook and put it on the Tokyo subway map. Now, you may not be able to see this from the back, but if you look sort of in the middle, but not quite in the middle, you see this sort of green blob that says, you. And, this is where we are right now. As we look at all these interesting and different technologies, it's almost like being released into a candy shop and saying, pick whatever you want. In that we see, and that's the positive way of spinning it. The negative way, of course, is that we see something flashing, we jump on it. It's like birds, easily distracted. And so what I thought I'd do, rather than starting with, and this is texting, and this is IM, and this is stuff that, hello? Is I thought I would work on, ask this question, why social everything? And I'll just tell you right up front that I hate the phrase social. Social network, social this. Maybe it's because I'm really an introvert and I have no friends. But, social networking sounds like a hookup for Friday night. And I could probably use that, but my wife wouldn't think so. And a lot of what's going on is this famous sort of phrase of, the technology is in fact the answer, says the consultant as he looks in, and then takes a moment, turns over to someone beside him and says, now, what was the question? Right? It's really interesting that as you look at things like the Library 2.0 literature and the this 2.0 and the this 3.0 and such, there's a real interesting trend that goes through that literature. And there's a real interesting venom that goes through that literature. I don't know if you've picked up on this. But it really is sort of change. We must change. And I'm all for change. I think change is a really important thing. I think we need to constantly change. I think we need to know why we're changing. And so oftentimes what I'm struck with is the notion that we feel this obligation to take on anything that's new. And one of the things, I'm working on a book chapter, so excuse this rather obscure metaphor, if you can read it later in the book chapter. In the really early days of navigation, back when the Greeks were putting boats on the ocean and the Portuguese were just starting to put boats on the ocean and take over and, rape and pillage and all that horrible stuff, they couldn't ever sail farther out into the ocean than they could see the shore. So they would have charts that would tell them this is how to get to XYZ location, and they would all be landmarks on the shore. And so they would have to stay always within view of the shore, because if they ever lost sight of those landmarks, they would be lost and they would in essence die at sea. Hence the idea of falling off the end of the ocean. And what it took after a while is someone figured out that using technology and these stars above us that don't change on a regular basis, we figured out, and I always get these wrong, but I believe it's latitude, which is north and south from the equator. And so now using a sextant, you could figure out how north and south, how close you were to and that took a couple hundred years. But you still had to stay within shore, because now you could tell how north and south you were, but you still had no idea how east and west you were. And it wasn't until we developed fine metalworks and springs for good clocks that we could take out into the ocean and set by the time back where at home, which turned into Greenwich Mean Time, that we could now figure out how east-west we were, and those became the meridians and all this wonderful stuff. My point with this story, is there are no lines marked in the earth on north and south. You don't trip over the equator. Really bad joke about, anyway. But the point is, it's a conceptual framework, and it's such a powerful conceptual framework of using time and stars that we use it today. I rented a GPS system that I got in my car, and while the stars are no longer the North Star and Polaris and such, they're now GPS satellites, and the time is no longer distance from Greenwich Mean Time, but time of transmission between these satellites. These concepts have allowed us to map the entire Earth and swim away from shore. And I think a lot of times with librarianships, without these deeper concepts and these more fundamental understanding, it's really easy to look for the landmarks and determine that's where the future is. And unfortunately, those landmarks have become increasingly technology-oriented, and they've become increasingly technology from outside of our own discipline. Now, instead of using this is the lighthouse and this is the cliffs of Dover, we're using this is Twitter's new feature and Google's new option. But what we're trying to do is not swim too far out from the shore, because we're not quite sure where that Earth falls off. And so what I wanted to is work a little bit today to talk about why social and why all this technology, but not from the sense of this is what you can do, but this is where we can ground this. And so the other example I have here, this is the Optimus Maximus keyboard, which has nothing to do with Transformers. And if you're a geek like me, you've probably heard about it. The Optimus Maximus keyboard is, yes, $1,600, and yours today. No. Why? Because every one of the keys on there is actually a little OLED screen. They're actually little screens that you can program. And so, for example, when you hit the shift key, all the characters suddenly draw themselves in uppercase. And you can program, you see there they program, for example, a Firefox button or Internet Explorer or Word button. So you could actually program any key to show you any character, which is cool. It turns out it sucks to type on. It's got no return whatsoever. So you start to go click, click, click. And so what we have is something that technologically is capable. We're able to do this. And it's really cool at some level, but it's really expensive and frankly sort of useless when it comes to the purpose that we want to solve. So what we want to do is sort of avoid that. Now, I should also preface this, and I have some people who can stand up and give testimonials that I am in fact an unreformed, unrelenting geek. And so this notion about technology is the answer could well have come from me in many situations. So if you want to get down and dirty and talk PHP code and internet domains and routers and all that stuff, we can do it. I blog, I wiki, I do it all. But the question that I want to work on today is why. And I want to start out in a very, very obscure community participation kind of way. And that is, and rather than starting with why social, I want to start with how we think. All right? So I'm going to give you a word. I'm hopefully going to give you a word. There's the word. All right? And I want you to think about what that word means. Just what is that word? All right? Keep it in your mind right there. Got it? All right. By show of hands, how many people look at a formula when you thought of it and said, that is in fact a chemical combination? I was right there. How many people thought that is in fact a mathematical expression? Very good. How many people thought it was baby food? New parents of the world unite. Now, this is interesting, right? Now, what happens if I in fact did this to begin with? Now, how many people think it's baby food? Right? It may well be. All right? these terms, these words, it's amazing that we're able to communicate on a regular basis because of this situation. What we run into every day is the fact that words mean multiple things, and we learn them in different ways, and we come to associate them in different ways. And so when you take these concepts and you move them out of the context in which they're presented, they become loose, they become flexible, they become malleable. But when you bring back a context, boom, comes right back to you. Let's go with another one. Light. All right, take a moment. Okay. Illumination. How many people thought illumination? Very good. How many people thought set a fire? We'll be watching you. Yeah, it's California. Everything's on fire. All right. All right. Standard California. How can you live here? Joke. Pestilence. Okay. Now, not heavy. Okay. How about now? It's like an eye test. Better, worse, better, worse. One more. Now, I know the reason you're laughing is because you were all thinking about the Object Management Group's latest report. Or perhaps Omnicom Media Group. And maybe, just maybe, if you were thinking about, oh my God. Right? Now, here's one. What technology am I talking about with oh my God? So in fact, from these two concepts, I can actually build out the third, which is, it's from a cell phone, right? Now, why I keep coming back to you is this idea that somehow the world can be reduced to one way of organizing it or understanding it doesn't work. That we learn things in contexts. And in fact, what happens is we can scaffold these concepts together. Our memory and how we think about it's relational. I know you're sitting there going, Dave, how does this deal with instant messaging? We're getting there. So what happens if we take these scaffolded concepts, formula as chemical combination, light as illumination, and oh my God, right? What happens when we put these things together? I'm not singing It's a Small World after all, right? I put these images together, oh, okay, yeah, that's fine, I can see that. That can add gunpowder has a chemical formula and lights in it, okay, that's fine. So I want to try a few more other things because what's happening is I'm just quickly demonstrating, this is how our brains work. Our brains take concepts and put them together. And they don't put them in these nice little stacks and orders and boxes. It puts them together as networks of connected concepts and connected ideas. In fact, the neurobiologist will tell you that if we didn't think this way, this conversation would really suck. Because if you look at the actual time it takes to transmit electrical signals through your neurons to get to the part of the brain that stores language and get it back and recall it and connect it together, it would take about 12 seconds between utterances. So, I would have to talk like that. But we don't. We anticipate what's coming next. We know, for example, if I talk about catalogs, that you're probably thinking about library catalogs and not things from JCPenney's, right? I'm in a library conference. I'm not expecting him, when he talks about catalogs, to talk about cashmere. I'm expecting him to talk about Mark, what have you, right? So I want to give you a few more of these. And what's happening is, how do we get these in our heads? Well, we go to school. We listen to our parents. We experience daily life. We get education. We go through life and we build up these connections. And increasingly, as you get older, past the age of about 4, these concepts become socially derived. In essence, because you grew up in America, or you grew up in whatever country, you will have certain connections that others may not. Because you have Masters of Library Science, you will have connections that others may not make, but they're not your own, they're socially derived. Let me give you an example of that. What am I talking about? Clearly, I am talking about the wonderful book by Carol Walter on sticky buns, right? A book about buns. How about this one? Nike, right? It's the idea, and just one, I'll let you fill in the picture yourself on this. Right? Caleb was talking about what do we call things and what do we write them. We have to understand there's baggage here. Right? The language that we use and that we communicate back and forth comes from somewhere. It is not naturally derived. It is not organic. I'm sorry. It is not inorganic. I'm going to take a moment. the language that we use is not sort of existent in the world that we discover. We create it socially. We create it and we understand these things. Now, this concept of taking terms, and I'm just working with words now, we could have done with images, taking terms and realizing that they are socially derived has great utility, right? And so, for example, when you look at things like tagging, take a moment. Now that should clear up a few things around here, he says. This has great utility, and we see this in things like Flickr, and we see these in tag clouds, and we see all this interesting information. And it does have great utility. In fact, it has great utility because most of the library profession is based on these concepts. Dewey, anyone? Library of Congress classification, anyone? These concepts that somehow one word describes one thing is ridiculous. And even in the library world, we gave that up a long time ago. And so we built hierarchies. And the idea that somehow these meanings cascade. But you can see from Caleb's example of virtual reference that that doesn't necessarily even flow through. I don't agree with this. I do agree with this. I don't do. And so tagging is a good example of where it turns out that if you get a group to input terms on something, it actually, over time, with enough people working on it, kind of does well to identify something online. I would point out that if you look at tagging, a lot of us are looking in catalogs and saying, can we add tag clouds and can we tag books and all this other stuff. I would warn you that the other data it shows is that tagging is very temporally set. And what does that mean? That means that if I asked you to come up and give me 10 keywords about this object, and I came back to you a year later and just gave you the keywords, you would have no idea what this object is, right? This idea that, for example, 9/11 to us has a real interesting, unique, and definite context, and yet in 2000, if I had said 9/11 to you, you would have thought I was calling for help, right? Concepts change over time, and so by simply adding folksonomies onto things and assuming that they will make sense forever, we are nuts. It is why we have god-awful bureaucratic meetings about what word should we put in what part of the classification scheme, and why oftentimes people ignore. You know, it's interesting, if you look at adaptations of classification outside of the library field, people think they're brilliant ideas. They come together in a meeting, they develop a taxonomy, they put it on their website, they say, usability solved. And then they forget that every year you've got to go back and check it and change it and add it. Group editing. Wikis. Well, how does that have to do with tagging? Well, this idea of relational concepts. That what happens is, reason group editing, why wikis work really well, is that we get in there and we can futz with meanings back and forth. We can come to conclusions over time. We can say, this word's not quite right. I was in a committee meeting this morning, and I swear to God, it was like living in a wiki. You bring up the mission statement, it's like, well, do we want to use the word equitable, or do we want to use equity? Okay, and so, you know, just, I mean, how many people admit it are the wordsmiths? How many people, yeah, all right, we love them, we hate them, right? We love them after the fact, but during the meeting, they've got to die. But this idea that somehow concepts that over time that are socially derived, which means that we come to these terms and these relationships as a group as opposed to individuals, also has really interesting implications for credibility. And so, for example, Caleb, I'm just going to keep mentioning him again and again, brought up Google and how Google really changed and made search work. How did they do it? They did it by this concept. Google is a social search engine. Now, in today's language and lingo, we don't look at it that way because somehow people aren't manually adding things back and forth. But how does Google work? Google works on PageRank. What it means is, out in the internet, organically are a bunch of web pages, and they point to each other. Any page that gets pointed to most, in this case the center node, will instantly bump up in a result set. So what they're using is an organic social definition of relevancy. That means the thing that's pointed to the most is the most important. And it turns out that it is a fabulous surrogate for many, many things. Relevancy is one. Utility is another. Importance is another. It's not perfect. We know that we can mess with it all the frickin' time. Thank you, bloggers, right? The idea that somehow we can Google bomb, if you haven't read about Google bombing's cool. You can't do it anymore because Google figured it out. But the notion that when you went into, what is it, complete failure? And it pointed to the White House site, and then like 2 days later it pointed to Hillary Clinton's website, because everyone started realizing that if they put in the keywords with the right link, they can manipulate Google results. And we say, oh, they fixed that. But the truth is, if you put in Apple into the search engine, you will learn much more about computers than you will about fruits, right? The idea that if you put in flowers, you will get more shopping sites than you will get others, right? So even though they're socially derived, that also means they're easily manipulated and the algorithms matter. What if we could take that concept of socially derived meaning and put it into a little bit more unique context, which is rather than taking what everyone in the world thinks, let's pick a particular interesting subgroup like, say, librarians. And let's take an even more interesting subgroup of librarians, reference librarians, because you guys are much more interesting than the average bear. So what if, instead of looking at which pages everyone else points to, we looked at what pages reference librarians pointed to. And so we developed this concept, trademark, called reference weighting. And what reference weighting works is we still have those websites sitting up there, but rather than looking at how they point to each other, what we're going to do is in transactions look at which ones the reference librarians point to. All right? So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at transcripts. And we're going to pull out of those transcripts. Now we can't take the transcripts 100%, privacy issues, all that stuff. All we're going to do is grab the URLs that you folks point to. All right? So if you put a URL, and not from the patron, just from you, we take the URLs that you folks point to, and we actually worked with OCLC, and we took 3-4 months of question point transactions, mined all the URLs out of them, and we threw them into Google. Right? Google lets you say, just search these sites, roll your own website. So we did that. So all the algorithms are the same, all the underlying technology is the same, just the selection criteria is different. One selection criteria is reference librarians pointing to it, the other is Google used their normal page rank. And what we then did was a pre-test where we asked, given these results, which do you find more credible? Same interface, same algorithm, same look and feel. The only difference, and unknown to the person doing the rating, was that reference librarians picked them and not a general search. That red line at the top are the pages that came from Question Point. The URLs derived from Question Point. And all of these criteria, these different queries, 1 through 20 are different queries, are credibility markers. And what it means is that red line says that almost every query except for one, the results that came from reference librarians were found to be more credible than the ones that came from general Google. People trusted them more, even if they didn't know they were reference librarians picking them. This is interesting. Right? Because now we're coming up with these connections, these socially derived connections, but not general society, from a subset, from reference librarians, and we're finding impact. This should make everyone very happy, because what it means is even if they don't know they need us, they still like us. Right? And so we looked at reference extract and we started asking the same, we asked an interesting question, which is, do reference librarians, right? So we're going to go back to those words, formula, light, okay? And what's interesting is you notice that in each example there was a majority opinion. Not universal, but a majority. That usually means mathematical formula, for example. And we asked the question, if we look at the consistency of the way that you folks cite URLs, is there consistency there? Do librarians tend to point to the same stuff over and over again? Let me give you an example. This is what's called a histogram of URLs mentioned by an old service in 1992 to 2000 something called Ask Eric. Right? And what you see is every one of those colors, and they start to mesh together at the top, is a different website. Okay? So for example, the light blue band at the bottom, those are the percentage of time people pointed to the Department of Education's website. The dark blue pointed to a service called EDRS, which was the document delivery service for Eric. The orange line was actually the document delivery part of the document delivery website. Can you tell when they changed their website? So they merged them together. Right? This is an amazingly, what this thing shows you, because you can see those nice consistent bands, says that this service pointed to the same websites consistently over and over again. Okay? I can break this down, but if you get just the visual impression. Right? And this makes sense because this service had policies that said every time you answer a question, you must include an Eric search, and every time you include an Eric search, you must include information about document delivery. Right? Policy enforcement. This is Kids Connect. This is how school librarians answered questions about kids' questions on anything and everything in the world. And it's a very early service, so you're looking at about 96 data. 1996, and earlier data, so there weren't a lot of consistent websites. You notice there's very little consistency. By the way, the blue is Google at the bottom. Right? So this, just to show you how screwed up life can really be, I know this looks like Art Deco. I love these pictures. This, see, you didn't know you were going to be forced to look at data today. Damn it. This is how scientists refer to information when asked questions. From the National Science Digital Library, they were getting questions on what is a black hole, what is the meaning of life, are there little green men on Mars, whatever. This is their citation pattern. What's interesting about this one is you know it's completely chaotic. There's no consistency whatsoever. They'll point to lots of stuff. The other thing is you'll notice that all the bands are pretty thick, all those little areas of color, versus, say, ask Eric, I know we're podcasting, so I'll be right back. See all these little itty-bitty ones up here? That means lots and lots and lots and lots of sites, like 30,000 of them. See how there aren't that many color bands here? That means scientists don't cite.
They cite themselves and the other scientists.
That's right, but this isn't citation pattern, formal citation pattern. This is literally answers to kids' questions. So when you ask them what a black hole is, they'll say it's a big gravity sink. That's the answer. You ask a reference librarian, they'll say, NASA says it's whatever. Right? All right, ready for question point data? This is about a year-old data. How consistent are you guys? Whew, solid, baby. By the way, number one, from this sample, the number one site was Public Law Library in California. The number two was Wikipedia. Caleb, number one cited for Oregon? Wikipedia. So let's stop having that conversation, shall we? All right. My point of all of this, right, is that what happens is reference librarians, you folks, consistently point out connections. Now, this could be groupthink, but in fact, this is the thing that we're going to talk about building search engines upon. Right? I want you to think about that for a moment because I'm coming back to what's this texting and what does this have to do with social networking. What I'm getting to the point is that we as human beings relate information together. We come up with relations. We don't store things as chunks. And it turns out with certain subgroups like us, we do it in a very consistent way. All right? Now, the other thing that I need to add here is something called scaffolding, which is what we do is we build concepts upon other concepts. Right? So we learn that 2 plus 2 is 4. We then learn that 2 times 2 is 4. And we learn that because what we have is 2 2's. And now that we understand those concepts, we can go on and go on and go on. You know, if you've been in classes and instruction, this is where we build foundational knowledge and we then add additional knowledge on top of. Right? If you've ever been in, by the way, very, very bad instruction, they don't do that. They say things like, click here, now click here, now click here. And if you stop and say, why? They say, now click here, right? Now, I'm just going to take a little aside for a moment. Think about the systems that we put in front of our users, like catalogs, right? Think about catalogs for a moment and think about their scaffolded, their knowledge, their socially understood and derived meaning that they are bringing to your catalogs. And think about how completely useless it is. That if they don't, why is it that study after study shows that librarians find catalogs extraordinarily effective? You folks find catalogs brilliant. You do. When you put them side-by-side studies, you folks can work those systems left and right. And you put a user in front of them and it falls flat. Oh, well that's because they don't know something. That's right, because they didn't take 2.5-year master's degree to figure it out. Right? So the same thing that annoys me about people talking about how books are so intuitive. Yeah, we only take, 8 years of someone's life to teach them how to read? Right? There's everything is miscellaneous. There's a great little story that the author tells about how in the middle of meetings, everyone has their laptops opening, and so when they hear something they don't talk, they can go do a quick web search, they learn about it, and therefore they can be better in the conversation. And he says, therefore, we have commoditized knowledge into little bits and we can consume them on demand. The problem is, how did they know which website to go? Did they know how to read the language? Did they understand the domain? There's so much scaffolding that, of course, when I bring up a concept like cataloging, I don't take 10 hours to do it because you've already had 300 hours of it before you showed up. Right? Now, we can scaffold concepts, and I want to take, and I'm moving to the social stuff, I really promise. And I want to talk about how sort of interesting to scaffold concepts. And so here are two concepts, the Spanish Crusades and modern medicine. Right? And these are related. And I'm going to give you the relation. I'm going to do it relatively quickly. The Muslims occupied the Iberian Peninsula in Spain during the Dark Ages, during the Middle Ages. And what happened was, at one point, the Pope sent mercenaries to go liberate the southern Spain from the Moors. He did this primarily to get rid of the mercenaries from destroying every other part of Europe. And they went in and they ransacked it and they took the city, which in truth didn't happen because it was basically a handshake deal because everyone had intermarried by that point. And when they got into the city and took over the city, what did they find there? They found thousands of libraries, amazing libraries, full of all these huge volumes of text. And most of the text was in Arabic, but was translated from the original Greek. And what it turned out, that they had rediscovered all the information they had lost in the rest of Europe. And so what happened was they began translating all these Arabic texts, rediscovering algebra, rediscovering Aristotle, rediscovering Socrates, and this huge flood of information hit all of Europe. And what happened is people realized that if they could understand and take root in this knowledge, primarily in law, they could get ahead in the world. And so in order to do this, what happened is people banded together and they hired tutors in the topic that would come and teach this. And those tutors eventually became professors, and those bands of students eventually became colleges and then universities. And the model of students hiring the professor became the predominant model of higher education until actually in the 18th century in modern medicine. What was happening is students were hiring their professors to teach them to be doctors, and they didn't necessarily take well to getting a bad grade. So what happened is we were producing doctors who knew nothing of medicine. In fact, when the president of Harvard declared that we should have a written examination for doctors, all the professors balked and fought against it because none of their students were literate. Right? And so what happened is Johns Hopkins, they decided they had to change this model. One of the major models they changed was the idea that you hired the professors as faculty and the students paid tuition, but it wasn't a direct correspondence. This radically changed and improved medicine, and to this day, what we're dealing with is people practicing medicine taught rigorously by a faculty in a clinical setting. So clearly, the Crusades led directly to modern medicine. Now, you don't find that in a history book because it doesn't come from one text. It's not a linear concept, and yet you can follow it. And what's interesting is if I then asked me, Dave, cite this, I would cite things like, well, I went to Wikipedia to learn about the Spanish Crusades. And then there's this guy named James Burke who did the Day of the Universe Change that talks a lot about the idea of the impact of this information flowing into Europe. And then I learned a lot in World Book. And then if you ever want to, by the way, the best book ever written in terms of modern medicine, The Great Influenza by John Barry, who talks about the modernization of medicine. The point is, this relation of these concepts had actually very little to do with the artifacts in which they were derived. And yet I would ask you, what is your job? If you define your job as getting someone to a thing, you're in the wrong business. Because what you're doing is you're going back to this idea that somehow knowledge can be commoditized in little units that we can hand to people. And when you keep going with that logic, you believe that you can somehow organize these commoditized bits of knowledge for everyone in the world, and then you begin to make the horrible mistake that somehow these little bits are true, or right, or correct. And you forget that all of those things are simply artifacts of the process of relating information together, which is all about context. Your job is not to get someone to a thing. I think all the time when I hear a lot about virtual reference, it almost always turns into having conversations with undergraduates about knowing what a journal article is. Wow! Great, I'm a tour guide on the information superhighway. What your job is to get someone to knowledge, to get them to understand. And if our job is about connecting things in people's heads, about making sense and educating them, our job is about context and connections and not the things we're pointing to. We've realized now for the past 20 years that you can have a library with no collection, that you guys make a library. A big bin of books does not a library make. It's you who bring order and organization and understand how that makes a difference in people's life with an education mission that makes you into a library. So a real clear example. This is the Gutenberg Bible. Well, this isn't it. It's a picture of the Gutenberg Bible. Right? And Gutenberg Bible is a great example because I love the Gutenberg Bible because this was the end of memory. And now we're having discussions that Wikipedia is the end of memory. So someday, memory will end. But who will be there to remember that it happened? Now, what's great about this book is it's just the same thing that I started with the word formula. This is exactly the same thing as the word formula. Because some people look at the Gutenberg Bible and they see it as the origin of printing. They look at this as a landmark in information containment. They look at it as a historical referent. Yet others look at this as an artifact to be preserved. They look at it and they worry about the binding. They worry about how we can keep it in an airtight container. By the way, did you realize there's a Gutenberg Bible in Austin, Texas? Okay. Oil money is a great thing. I love that story, right? Texas folks, right? The idea that some percentage of the oil wealth had to go to universities, but they couldn't use it for capital improvement or personnel, so they just started buying stuff. And so there's like all this amazing stuff in the middle of Austin, Texas. So if you ever, you know, nothing? Touche! All right. And the crowd turns on him. Okay. Some people see this as an artifact to be preserved. Others look at this as a religious truth. Right? People look at this and they say, it's the Bible. This is the truth. And some people mean literally, this is the truth. Right? All of these are different views of that artifact, that thing. And all of them have massive and different implications for that. So what are we trying to do in a reference interview? We're trying to understand the context. What is I get myself in trouble. Susan can back me up on this one. But for many years, people say, oh, there's Dave Lankus. He doesn't like the reference interview. Because in early conferences, I always said, what is the use of the reference interview? And people always interpreted that as, so what's the use of a reference interview? When really it was, what is the use of the reference interview? And the answer is to figure out where we're going with this, right? Now, this is the real important part. That ring around the object is your job, not the thing in the middle. Reference, by its very nature, has become about the world of context. Reference started out radically differently. Reference started out as a patch on bad indexes. Reference started out as the systems are too complicated, we'll put the help system in, and there she is. Right? Now, this is the truth, because I'll argue this isn't just the world that reference needs to be in. This is the world libraries need to be in. That ring around the object is what we've always been about. We've just used tools that are efficient for doing that, like books and materials. I always say equating libraries with books is like equating dentists with drills. It's what's predominant in the public mind and not necessarily the most important thing they do. What's also an interesting analogy is, when is the last time you've walked out of a dentist where you did not need to get a filling done and said, thank God I went to the dentist? You walk out and you go, boy, I did a good job brushing and flossing my teeth, right? Yet, if without the dentist to understand that whole process, we would have a problem. What is the context that matters here? What is the important thing here? It's the user that defines that context, not the object. We've known for years that when you catalog a book, we're not somehow magically pulling out the descriptive information from the book. We're applying our worldview upon the book. We did a really interesting technical study looking at metadata assignment. So in K-12 education, right now there's a fixation on things called academic standards. They say, you should be teaching these things, right? So you need to teach this mathematical concept or this English context, things like that. And the goal from National Science Foundation was to automatically read a lesson plan or read an educational module and assign a standard. And we thought this wouldn't be too tough because standards are standards. They're well-formulated, well-thought-out ontologies. And what we found out was we could get almost as good as people doing it, but the problem was if you get two people doing it, they have two different answers. Because what we finally realized, we're slow, is that we were applying the standard to the object. It wasn't that the object was somehow comporting to the standard. In education, we know this a lot of times. If you give a same lesson plan to two different teachers and you ask, is this a good lesson plan or a bad lesson plan? One teacher will say it's a horrible lesson plan. The other will say it's great. And you'll ask, why is this a horrible lesson plan? They go, it doesn't have evaluation criteria. It doesn't have the link to standards. It's not well structured. Why was this one great? It had a picture of George Washington and I'm teaching him tomorrow. Right? The way in which we interpret this information is completely user-driven. And yet, if you look at the focus of a lot of the efforts that we do in library land, and I include reference within that, it is object-driven. And you say, oh, those catalogers have screwed it up royally. You're right, Dave. And I ask you, subject guides, anyone? Pathfinders, anyone? Caleb talked about usability testing. A lot of what I would argue that you need to do in terms of usability testing is literally identify the language that people are using in the world. And understand that that language is not a product of bad, good, indifferent education. It is a socially derived meaning. So what does this participatory approach tell us? And then I'm bringing up the big technology again. It tells us, first of all, that the user is in complete control. Now, this stuff seems relatively simple, but I would argue that if you take it to a logical conclusion, a lot of what we do changes. For example, where is those Ask a Librarian button that we've been talking about all day? Take a moment. It's an obvious answer. Nope. It's on a library website. Because clearly the user's website is the library website, right? Right? And so what we try and do is say, oh, we'll get a Facebook app. We'll put it in Facebook. This is a good start. But the notion is, think about for a moment how reference is. We've modeled virtual reference on physical reference, which is a facility which we stand by for someone to come into our information, ask us a question, where we have better tools. What blows me away, and I don't want to pick on any one particular vendor, but isn't it amazing that when we look at the tools that we provide librarians in this transaction and we look at ones that we provide user, isn't it amazing that they basically surrender and say, you outgunned me, I'm going away. Because we can pump scripts at them, right? I mean, virtual reference software is the best piece of software I've ever seen to make people sound like machines. A librarian will be with you shortly. I am reading your question now. I will be with you shortly. Did you do this, right? This notion that this is a human interaction, but what's more important, it's the user's interaction. They should have as good of tools as possible. The other one that somehow it's a one-to-one. Who defines reference uniquely as one-to-one? Now, Caleb and I actually don't disagree on this. Caleb would tell you there is important times when it should be a one-to-one interaction, and I agree. But I would also argue there are many times when you want a many-to-many interaction. That when a user is working on something, what Caleb talked about, these larger stories, you're only one point in that story. Can't we provide systems that allow people a little bit longer length than that? So the analogy is rather than having the physical desk where I sit, look unbusy, and smile, and wait for the reference librarian to come up to me, because there's absolutely no power relationship going on right here, right now. I'm not standing above you at all, right? What we do is imagine instead that someone walks in and we give them a desk. You got a question? Here's your table. And what they begin doing is they pull up materials and resources, they begin laying them out on the table, and they begin making piles. And we all do piles. Oh, this pile's about this, and this pile's about that, and these authors agree, and these authors don't disagree. And now when I have a question, I can invite you, the librarian, over and say, I'm stuck. And rather than you start with the most insulting virtual reference question ever, have you searched Google, we can start with, give me a second. Hey, that's an interesting connection. I see when you're talking about formula, you've got all these chemistry books. I don't have to start with baby formula, right? This notion that somehow we can expose the user's thinking and their connections to us as opposed to us pulling it out of them, or as Sarah Weissman said, putting them on the rack until they tell us the truth. This is a user-oriented view. It's not just about being in Facebook, it's also being Facebook in the sense of what are the norms, what are the cultures, what's expected. I heard a lot of reference librarians when they were presenting about Facebook talking about how they could get out of the anti-spam filters because they were trying to sort of send unsolicited information to these people to inform them. And it's like, you're spamming them? Maybe this isn't where you want to be? Right? This isn't the culture. I'm not expected to do that. It's all about learning. When you talk about facilitating knowledge, when you talk about a reference transaction as facilitating someone's knowledge, access is only one part of that. This concept that we still have of the neutral librarian, where you ask the reference question, you walk them to the shelves, you point to the book and walk away so that you may not disorient them or provide them with some bias, is crap. This idea that somehow it's like walking someone into this room and saying, learn. It doesn't work that way. Access to information, pointing them to the article, pointing them to the online database is insufficient for knowledge acquisition. And if we're in the knowledge business, we need to understand it. We need to know what is the necessary information they need to consume this data. So when someone asks a question about black holes, are they asking because they're a graduate physics student, or are they asking it because they're a 12th grader? Or they're asking because they're 5 years old, they just heard on TV. Context kinds of matters, right? So what do you already know and what do I have to bring up to speed? Now we do some of this. For example, here it's in this online database, ... Do you have any clue what an online database is, right? We try and do some of that in our interaction and processes. How about the engaging environment? A lot of what Murray Radford's work, for example, on the question encountering is the language that we use back and forth is setting up an environment. Are we inviting people to learn, or are we simply in a functionary way providing them data? We used to provide a service called Virtual Reference Desk where we'd send questions to all these different services, and one of them was called Ask Dr. Neutrino. And eventually we stopped sending questions to Ask Dr. Neutrino. Why? Because they gave the wrong answer? No, they gave great answers. Why? Because every so often they'd say, as you should have learned in high school physics, this is the answer. Right? The best thing you can do is go through your transcripts and you will find the equivalent of that in some of your own reference librarian's answers. Right? The third one, by the way, is motivation, which is to, hey, good job, good find, recognizing that information some way, which it comes back to the social. Because how do we recognize the user contributions to our libraries? Huh? We don't even put our own faces and names up on our library websites. You want to put our users up there? Yeah. Right? This idea that they're all in control. Learning is a collaborative conversation. The library serves as facilitators. True facilitation means shared ownership. You want to know how to improve your virtual reference service? Where is your advisory board that includes users on a regular basis? If your primary users are K-12 students, how many high schoolers do you bring in each day to sit down and go through the transcripts and ask how you're doing? How many of them do you determine how you name services? How many people that when they don't find an answer in the catalog, right, the two answers that a catalog gives to a zero-hit response, I'm stupid or you're stupid. Right? Put in a query to your catalog, and does it say, did you check the spelling on this? Did you do this? No. How did you screw up? And how many of them say, oh, interlibrary loan, meaning we clearly don't have it, go to interlibrary loan. What about the third option of, don't see it, add it? And people go, oh, you can't add it. They're asking the question, how they know the answer. Why not ask a reference question? So the next time a user puts in that query, instead of getting 0 results, they get a question and an answer that has the pointer. Or, God forbid, someone else finds it and they do have the answer and they upload the document or put a new pointer in. This idea that somehow we lock down the system so that it is librarian patron, we need to blur it left and right. How many people, when you get a question from a faculty member, ever in the response say, and by the way, do you mind if I send you a question or two every so often? Incorporating the actual faculty or community official. I got to remember our hands, so you lonely public librarians. How many of you send questions on a regular basis or have a liaison within the mayor's office so that when you get questions about Department of Public Works or Human Services, you can on a regular way connect back and forth and they use the same systems? Right? Invest in tools for creation over the collection of artifacts. That's not directly a reference answer, but the notion, once again, that instead of someone coming and looking for your frequently asked questions or looking for your pathfinders, do we give them the tools to create their own pathfinders? their own frequently asked questions. So when someone comes in and they're the manga expert, we see this all the time. We have manga clubs in our library. Do we have them online so that people can blog about manga, people can create pathfinders for manga, and the library is the place that provides some of that? And by the way, we're pointing to external services, and they can post it in their MySpace pages. So taking these central concepts, and coming back to Din's email. Now, instead of looking at this as a bunch of lists of independent items, now let's take our new navigational apparatus, our theory and our concepts, and now look at them. Why is it that IM works very well for reference when it does not involve page pushing and co-browsing? Why is that? Well, let's see. Because fundamentally I'm having a conversation, and you know what? IM and chat work pretty well for that. Not all cases, sometimes co-browsing makes sense. But what is IM allowing us to do? Have a conversation. Talk to people. What is chat in real time? Have a conversation. Talk to things. Chat services, delightful. I think it's great. But I think it's also very interesting that if you ask a bunch of college students what chat looks like and what we call chat, they're radically different. We don't use internet relay chat services. We don't have 50 people coming into a cauldron of discussion and letting them sort of fight out what they're talking about. What we do is we say, no, it's a formal one-to-one thing on my page. We don't give you a client to install in your own system. Commercial versus homegrown, I don't care. Homegrown I do care about though. Because here's the real problem, is that these systems don't yet exist. One of the things that I really, really worry about, that as a library profession, we do when we constantly sail close to the shore and look for these landmarks, is we constantly seek to adapt technology that was not developed for our purposes. And so this concept of knowledge creation, it's like, are we in the same business as Google? No. Thank you. What business is Google in? Advertising. Not just commercial money stuff, thank God, but advertising. Well, everything they do to draw eyes is, right? Are we in the same business as Amazon? No. What are they doing? Selling items, not even books. I love the idea that somehow Amazon is books. You can buy like yard furniture on Amazon and drills, and I mean, they're the Walmart of online environments, right? They're selling things. What are libraries doing? They should be facilitating conversations to increase the knowledge of their community. That's a big word for it. We should be in the world of education. We are in the same business as professors and as teachers and as K-12 institutions. That's the world that we should be looking for, saying, you know what the number one piece of technology that if you're in an academic environment you should care a lot about? Course management systems. Why should you care about them? Because they're becoming the primary system and they suck. Course management systems suck. You know why they suck? They suck for the same reason catalogs suck, which is they're thing-based. I have a professor. I upload a bunch of readings. I upload a quiz. Go. Where's the context? Where's the flow? Where's the movement? Where's the discussion? Oh, we have a discussion board. Can I discuss directly, topic by topic, this article? Well, no, you can read the article and they come. Right? It doesn't make sense. This is the world that we have the opportunity to work in. So when you go into Meebo, that's IM. Plugins, IM. Social networking. Why do people do social networking? Because they're looking to like make a date? Sure, maybe. But a lot of the reason you look at the use of social network sites, you look at Wikipedia versus Encarta. The growth for Wikipedia goes up here, Encarta stays like this. They're both encyclopedias. One allows you to participate, control, and shape it. One does not. Why do social networking sites go crazy? It's not the functionality. If you ever look at the functionality of something like Flickr or Facebook, they're really low. They're thin, right? I can blog. I can add this box. I mean, it really isn't a very sophisticated set of features we give them. Now look at your catalogs. You can do all this wonderful stuff, right? Well, what the difference is that with all that wonderful capability we have in our catalogs and everything else, we force people through one route. With Facebook and MySpace, they can shape the world around them. When you want to learn, you want to engage in conversation. When you engage in conversation, you assume you have power in that relationship. You assume that you get to shape part of that conversation. There are two people involved. Are our library systems, in essence, lecturing to our users? In essence, doing what I'm doing right now. Right? Are they telling the users how it's organized or what we can get? Or are they engaging them to say, what do you need and where can we go? I agree with Caleb. Reference is an essential part of that. I just hope that that idea can get pushed to all parts of the library and isn't seen just as that crazy department up front. Right? Flickr, YouTube, texting for reference, yeehaw. My point with all of this, I told you I'd talk about it all. I didn't say I'd talk about it well or in depth. My point with all of this is that reference has an obligation here. You have an obligation here. This is a chord that I have used many, many years now. First of all, our obligation is to innovate from core principles. We have an obligation. First of all, play. Go nuts. When you see new technology, play with it. I am a huge believer in play. If you don't Twitter, Twitter. If you don't blog, blog. Go crazy, because how can you tell whether something matches core principles or not if you don't know what it is? So don't dismiss any technology out of hand. But realize that you're playing. And realize that playing often does not involve a committee. Innovate from core principles. When you look at whether we're going to text or MySpace or SMS or, and here's a real good one, make our own systems, what are we basing them on? Are we basing them on these nearshore landmarks where we say, well, everyone's going to Facebook. Clearly, Facebook is the way for us to go. Well, why do we stop and ask the question, why is everyone going to Facebook? I would argue they're going to Facebook because it's a world that they control and shape and have conversations in. They are looking at online environments that they can develop systems for. Is everyone familiar with the the sucks.com phenomenon? Sucks.com is brilliant. There isn't a site. I'm sure there is a site. I'm scared to find what's on it. But what happened is someone went into Walmart. They went to complain. They wouldn't let them, so they put up walmartsucks.com. Right? And then, so anytime you go up to an organization, you say, I have a complaint and it's not heard, they can put up a .sucks site. So have you looked? Is there a mylibrarysucks.com? I mean, it'd be nice if there were. That means at least they care enough about us. But the point is that on an internet environment, if you don't enable conversation, if you don't allow conversation, conversation will move somewhere else. Conversation is what people are looking for, and it's not so they can just talk. It's so they can learn and know and shape their worlds. What they want the online environment to look like are those first examples of this plus this equals this. They want to show you and see the connections in their world. What's a blog roll? A blog roll is their way of saying, this is the network of which I am a part. Right? It's a way of connecting the universe that makes sense to them. Does our library allow them to come into online, in person, to connect their world and shape their world? Or does it say, here's what the world looks like. Get used to it. Right? We need to question tradition. We need to, on a regular basis, ask, should we still be doing this? I said this in San Antonio in, when was that, 2005? Who in the world dictated that virtual reference looked like a big open pane, a chat box that scrolls up on the side? The answer is Steve Kaufman forced this into it when they went with, what was it, eGain. It was eGain, and suddenly everyone copied it, and it's nuts. Why does it look the way it looks? Why do we call it Ask a Librarian? Why do we call it Adult Service? Why do we call it Reference? Why do we call it... I'm not saying you can't say, well, this is a good answer. I'm willing to go with it. I'm just asking you on a regular basis to ask why. And everyone needs to ask that question, and we need to hold visionaries account. You can't let Dave come up here and shout and be very affirmative and assume that I'm right. Where's my data? Where's my theory? Where is it? When people get up and say, Library 2.0 is the answer, say, why? And everyone needs to do it. After this, come up and yell at me. And if you didn't get a chance to yell at me, send me email and say, you idiot, this is the right answer. Because if you just sit there, and you will do it, if you just sit in the back of the room and go, I'm an idiot, I would rather them yell why. I'm tired of people sitting in the back going, well, in my library, it wouldn't work. Right? Or, oh yeah, how many years has he been a librarian? Stop it! Stop it! This field needs to, on a regular basis, get together every year in an annual conference and yell, why? Right? We need to, on a regular basis, ask about what is the future of reference, because the answer is you. And what is the future of library? You. This idea that somehow God gave us a building with books and said, thou shalt have a public services department, is crap. I mean, in Arizona, they got rid of Dewey, and we thought that was somehow miraculous. It was like, what? It was burned into the books? No, they just said, screw it, we'll do this. We're allowed to do that. Who said library science is done? Who said reference is done? Who said that once you got your degree, you are done? Every day we need to ask the question, why? And an equal obligation to then try and answer it when someone else asks us that question. And I don't care if you're working at the reference desk or if you're the director, you've got to do it. And I'm tired of hearing people go, I don't want to become the management position because it's them. Screw it. You have an obligation. Every one of us has an obligation. If you think that ALA Council is antiquated, run for ALA Council. If you think that your director is crazy, try and take their job. I mean, if you're pissed off at library science education, come yell at us on a regular basis, but also realize that you have to agree to teach. You have to agree to mentor. This notion that somehow we're done and that we're just waiting for the next Dave Lankus or the next Steve Kaufman or the next Stephen Abramson to stand up and say, this is the direction we shall all go, is nuts. Unless I start growing a long beard and have a staff and a couple of tablets with 10 things on them, I can making this crap up, right? And you can too. This is what we're doing. So when you look at why social, here's my answer. Conversations, knowledge, learning. I have a theory behind it. I have data. Let's try it. Let's see if it works. And if it doesn't work, come back and say, nope, didn't work. Let's try this. You have that obligation. So with that, I will shut up and take questions. Do I have time for questions? Or
No.
No?
But we do have time
Why?
for questions because we're going to have Michelle and Caleb come up and give you all an opportunity to ask questions of all three.